Everybody, this is Jason with devslopes.com, and in this video we are going to build the next section of our website. All right, it's this part right here. Now, before we dive into our HTML and we start, hashing away and building our structure here, let's look at the page to get a visual of what we want to build here. So at the top, we've got this text. It's a header of the page, and it's introducing this new section to us. And we can see that we've got 3 boxes here. So we can assume that there's going to probably be 3 columns here. All right. And then we've got a Learn More button down here at the bottom. All right. Very cool. So let's dive into our text editor and start building this structure out. So we're going to place this, if we select this first container, which contains the first part of our website, we want to start right underneath this, right? Because we're building a new container now. So go ahead and press enter, and let's build this next part. So at the top of this section we're building, we've got this header text. So what I'm going to do is there is an element called header. All right, so we can go ahead and create one of those. And you might be wondering, wait a minute, why aren't we starting off with a container like we've talked about this whole time? Well, we want the header to sit on top of the container, all right? Because we're going to be putting 3 columns into it, right? So we need the header to sit on top of all of that information. Now, the other cool thing to note about the header tag is the header tag acts like a container of its own. It contains introductory content, and you can put things in it such as 1 or more headings, like a header 1 through a header 6 tag. You can put a logo or icons in them. And on the flip side, some of the things you can't do with these header tags is you cannot put a header inside of a footer. And the footer is the bottom containers that you put at the bottom of your website. So you can't put headers inside of your footers. You can't put headers inside of address tags, like where you're going to be typing out address information, and you cannot nest a header inside of a header. All right, so now that we know that, let's go ahead and add the header tag here, right? Since that's what we can put in here. And we named this the standards of awesomeness. All right, cool. So we've got this header tag. Let's go ahead and preview this. I'm going to hit the lightning bolt over here. Wait for this to load up. All right, cool. So I remember that the text was in the center and it was a little bit bigger. So let's do that. So come back to the text editor here. And we're going to add a class to this because we know we want to specifically interact with this element. Now, I could probably just grab the header element and then grab the child here, but there might be other header tags throughout my website, and I want to make this one specific. I want to make a special styling for it. So go ahead and add a class to it, and I'm just going to call this section 2 header. All right, because it's the second section of our page here. So I like that. So let's come into our styles here and add some styling to this. So I'm going to scroll down here, and I remember we made some other header 1 stylings here, so I want to keep the similar classes grouped together. So let's grab we can actually just go ahead and grab the header 1 with the section 2 header class to it. And I typed that wrong. All right, section 2 header. Awesome. And we know that we want the font size to be bigger. All right, so let's increase the font size. And I'm going to add probably 65 pixels. I want this to be fairly large. And we can go ahead and I'm going to toggle back here. Awesome. So that's good. That looks like a header to me. I like the size of that. And then we want to go ahead and center it. Because the header element is a container of itself, it kind of acts like a block element. So it's going to be really, really easy to move the text inside of here. So come back and go to this class we're working with, and we can go ahead and put a text align of center on it. And this should center everything up for us. And it does. That's fantastic. And the next thing we're going to do is let's start building the 3 columns down below. So in our text editor, now this is where we want to add our container. So we want our header to sit on top of the container for us. So we can go ahead and create a div class of container and close that off. And our columns are going to exist inside of a row. So let's go ahead and create a div class of row. And then we know inside of here that we're going to have 3 columns. So let's build our first column. And if you scroll over to where we put our columns, we actually numbered these really, really well. Like the column 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. If you think about it, a column 1 has a width of 8.33%, which means 12 of these column 1s is going to equal up to 12 columns. We've used a column 6 before, which is a width of 50%. 6 plus 6 equals our max width of 12. And in this case, we're making 3 rows, so it's going to be a column width of 4, because 4 plus 4 plus 4 is 12. All right, so just an easy reference to do a little bit of quick math instead of always having to come up here and check out the percentage widths. All right, so we're going to put a column 4 class in here, and then we're going to start adding some content. So let's head back over to our page. Actually, we don't want that one. We want this one. All right, so it looks like in this column we are going to have a box with some rounded corners. Looks like we've used the radius. And we're going to have a logo element. We're going to have a label here. And we're going to have some text. All right, so it looks like that we're stacking 3 different elements on top of one another: an image, a label, and some text. All right, so let's start off with the first thing. Let's create a box, something visual that we can see, and then we can add our content inside of it. So come into your text editor here, and to build this box, I'm going to create a div tag, and we're going to want to add a class to this because this box is going to be a main element that we're going to be styling, right? So I'm going to go ahead and call it box. We'll go ahead and close that off and open it up. And looking at this, sorry, this is bugging me. This needs to come back. No, this can be tabbed in. All right, now it's slimed up. It was just off. All right, so let's scroll down here, and let's put this box element right underneath our section gradient. All right, because it's a main element, we'll kind of put it with more of a main element here. So grab the box by its div. Okay, and we're going to add some stylings here. So first off, let's add the border that's going around it. Okay, and that border, what it looked like, it kind of looked more like a box shadow. If we pull this up, it almost looks like these boxes are kind of hovering above the background here. All right, so first thing first, we know that the background color of our box here is white. Let's work with a new property we haven't talked about before. And we're going to be using a property called box shadow. All right, and what I want to do is first I want to type this out. Okay, so just follow along. I'm going to quickly type this out for us, and then I'm going to take us to a website that's going to describe each of these numbers here. That way I can give you a visual. So I'm going to add 3 zeros and 1 pixel, and then we're working with an RGBA, and we're going to do a 0, 0, 0, 0.15. Now you're probably like, whoa, Jason, what the heck? What are you doing? I don't even know what you're talking about. Well, that's okay, because I told you I'm going to tell you. All right, so you can see there's some craziness happening here. Now what I want you to do is open up your browser, and type in CSS shadow generator. And where we want to go is this one that's called cssmatic.com, okay, /box shadow. And this is going to give us a really cool understanding of exactly what's happening with those numbers. You can see here this is a backdrop shadow generator, and it generates a code snippet for you. But again, in the future when you're building your websites, I don't want you just copying and pasting stuff. You've got to understand how these numbers are working and what they're controlling. So the first number that we added to our box shadow was a 0. And that means that we're grabbing the horizontal length. And the horizontal length says, where do you want to place this shadow horizontally underneath your element? Okay. And we says, well, we want a 0. That means we want it directly underneath. Okay. The second number that we added after our box shadow was grabbing this vertical length. And you can see, again, this just takes the up and down the vertical of the shadow and asks us, where do you want to place this underneath your element? And we says, I want a 0. All right. The fourth 0 we put in was the blur radius. And you can see the blur radius is what takes the shadow and adds this blur around it. We can either, if I offset this a little bit, we can either blur it into this total blur, or we can keep it solid. And in our case, we want to keep it solid. Okay. And then the spread radius, we put 1 pixel. Okay. So I'm going to change this back to 0. And what the 1 pixel does, oops, I hit 12, is check this out. It put a thin line around the box. All right. So that's exactly what we did here. Let's see, where is it? Right here. I'm covering it up to get this thin line here. All right. So I'm going to recap that real fast. We're controlling the horizontal length, putting it directly under our element, the vertical length, putting it directly under our element. We don't want any blur on this, so we set it to 0. And then the spread radius, we set to 1 pixel. We want it to barely display out here. Now let's go back to our text editor. And we just covered this first part here, the length, the vertical, the blur, and the spread. Okay, now we're working with an RGBA. All right. In our CSS basics lessons that we went over in this section in the beginning, we talked about 3 different types of colors. We talked about using color names, hex codes, and RGB colors. Well, you'll notice that it has an extra character added at the end of it. So basically, these first 3 numbers are the color, and then the A allows us to add an opacity, a transparency to our color, okay? So if we come back to our generator here, we see that the first color, the first number in there is setting a shadow color. Well, with the 0, we're saying we don't need a shadow color. We don't want one. And then the background color, we already set a background of white to our box. So we don't need a background color. I don't need a box color because we're not using a box color. I've set the background to white, and I don't need a box color here. And then we're setting the opacity all the way down to the 0.15, like this. So that's what we're saying in this over here. Now I want to do another thing. I kind of want to add kind of another layer on top of this to shift it around a little bit, to add another layer of color on top of our box. And what I mean by that is go ahead and create a comma. All right, down here, we're just going to select some number properties that we want. I want it still horizontally, directly underneath our element. For fun, let's add a 2 pixel to the vertical, and then let's create just a little bit of a blur here. We'll go ahead and do a 3 pixel. And then this time, since we're adding a blur, which kind of expands, I'm just going to say I don't want any spread on it. And then we can go ahead and add some colors here. Again, I'm going to put in 0s for these. And the only thing I want is I want to up the opacity just a little bit. So I'm going to say 0.1 instead of 0.15. All right, so let's go ahead and check this out. Now, before I look at this, I already know what's going to happen here. We haven't created any content inside of our box, so I bet we're just going to get a straight line because we gave it a thickness of 1 pixel. Let's see if I'm right. All right, and I was. We've got just a line going across here. All right, so let's add some content into this box that we just created. And the first thing that we're going to add is an icon, an image here. So back to our text editor. If you haven't already, I have provided a DevSlopes icon here. It has a dimension of 110 by 110 pixels. This was a very large image. It was like 350 pixels. I went ahead and I resized it to the actual size that I really want it to appear in my web page. You can use larger images and then with CSS scale them down. However, if you're using a larger image, that means you're using a larger file size, which means that the browser is going to take longer to load your web page if you have a lot of big graphics in it. So that's why I sized it down. All right, so how did I get 2 classes here? Let me delete this, and we've got an extra div tag, that means, and I'm going to delete this. All right, I might have copy and pasted something weird somewhere. All right, so inside of here, we want to wrap our icon, our image, in a div tag. We've done this before. It's always a good practice. Open that up, and let's go ahead and add our image. So to add an image, remember, we're just going to grab the image element, and we need to give it a source. And the source that we're going to add here is the dev icon. So go ahead and write dev icon, and that's completing it here for me, and we can close that off. All right, so we've got an icon in here. That's fantastic news. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and let's check this out. I'm going to refresh this. Awesome. We've got our image in there, and look, it's added some height to our box here. So I like that. That's cool. All right, so let's come back here. And I'm thinking what I'd like to do, just as a safeguard, is I want to make sure that I'm controlling the width of this image when the display changes sizes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a class to this. I'm just going to call it icon. And what I want to do with this is simply put a width of 100%. So my image is 110 by 110 pixels. I just want to make sure that my image is always 100% of whatever the display width of the screen is. So we can grab this. Let's grab it by the div and then icon. And I'm just going to go ahead and add a width of 100%. And this is just a safeguard that I'm taking here, because I want my image to be able to flex with the screen size if it needs to. Because right now it's a set in stone pixel width and height, and this is going to allow it to flex if it needs to with the screen size as it changes. All right, so we've got that in there, and let's go ahead and add the next thing that we have in here. So we've got a label in here, and I could, if I wanted, wrap this label into a div tag, but in this case, it's just a simple label to a box. I don't feel like I need to create a div tag around it right now. In the future, if I want to, it's really easy to do. Obviously, I would just space down and add the tag there. All right, so the first box said, chat with me. All right, so we've got a label. And the other thing, just like a header tag, the label works as a mini container, kind of like a div tag does. And so it's actually going to be able to just stack itself right underneath our image. So let's go to our page, and you can see that we've got this cute little text here. And we know with this label that we're going to want to increase the font size of this, okay? So what I'm going to do here is why don't we, in our style sheet up here, let's just scroll to the top. We're going to take the label because it's a standard element selector, and let's come right underneath the body, and I'm going to grab the label class, and let's increase the font size, and I know that I also want it to be bolder. All right, so let's change the font size, and heck, I'm gonna shoot in the dark here. Let's try 35 pixels, see how big that is. I do know that I want it to be more bold. So let's go ahead and we can use a new property we haven't used before, and this is called font weight. All right, there's a couple of things that we can do here. You can see that I can add a standard bold if I wanted to. Come back to the project, and that looks pretty good to me. But what if I want it to be even bolder? All right, I'm gonna switch back, toggle back to here. You might have seen, I'm gonna erase this, put the colon. See how it has these numbers? It has 100 through 900. Okay, those are font weights. So if I wanted to do, I think a bold is like around a 300. I could add a font weight of 600, which is going to give me a heavier font weight. And we can come here, and that actually is just a little bit bolder. So I want it just a hair bolder than bold. All right, so that's pretty cool. We've got our label. That's looking great. Let's go ahead and add the text that's underneath it. And I've already, it looks like, added the paragraph tags to this too. So let's add some text inside of this. All right, so I want you to go back to your browser here, and we're going to use placeholder text, okay, or dummy text, whatever you want to call it. And the real term for it is lorem ipsum. So I want you to type in lorem ipsum generator. And the reason that we use lorem ipsum in our websites is, say for an example, this website that we're building right now, say it's a prototype for like a client or somebody that you have. You use this kind of dummy text as a placeholder for text, and it looks a lot nicer than just like scribbling some letters on your keyboard. So I'm going to scroll down here for a little bit, and I'm going to copy everything that's right inside these quotes here. So Command C. I'm going to come back over to my text editor, and right in the middle of these paragraph tags, I'm just going to go ahead and paste it. All right, I might delete some of this text out of here. We'll see how big it is. Go ahead and refresh. Right now it looks good, but we already know that we need this paragraph text to be bigger. All right, so let's go ahead and grab the element over here, and right underneath my label, why don't we just grab the paragraph tags and add a font size. Let's try 20 pixels. Okay, that's usually a good font on a website to read. It actually looks kind of small to me. Let's bump it up just a little bit. I'm going to do this 28 pixels, and I also want to spread out the line height, and we've worked with that before. So usually, like on our body, we put a line height of 1. I'm going to make this just a tiny bit bigger. We'll do a 1.2 line height on this. And let's go back and check it out. I like that a lot better. Okay, that's looking great. Now, we want to get the content in here centered. All right, so all of this text, it lives within our box class, right? So I want to show you something that we can do here. Coming back to our text editor, let's scroll down to our box class, and it's right. I probably missed it, and you guys saw it, and you're like, dude, you passed it. Well, I found it now. All right, so above these backgrounds in the box shadow, we can add a text align of center to this. And here's why. We have the label and the paragraph tags nested inside of this box class. So if we put a text align center on the parent here, on the parent of our box, it's going to go through all the content that's inside of it, look at the children, and it's going to check which ones are text elements, and we can go ahead and align those text elements with this text align of center. So that should work. Let's go ahead and check that out, see if it worked. And it did. And hey, check that out. That actually grabbed our image and centered it for us as well. That's pretty cool. All right, let's come back to our text editor. And now that we've built some of the structure to this box, let's go ahead and highlight it. And we need 3 columns. So we're going to just paste it 2 more times. All right. So we just need the column. So I need it from this div tag here up to here. I'm going to go ahead and copy. And I'm going to bring this over just a hair. So before I take this column and I paste it 2 more times to complete our column width of 12, this text is looking way too big for me. Let's go ahead and delete this right up to, we'll just do Delore. All right, and I'm just going to add a period there. All right, find your closing div tag for your column. Let's come up here. We're going to copy and then come to the end here. We're going to hit enter, paste. We're going to hit enter again and paste. All right, and then we'll go ahead and rename these labels real fast. So this one's going to be learn to code. And then this one down here, we're just going to write build and empire. Cool. All right, so we got that rocking and rolling. Now let's launch this and see where we're at with these 3 columns. All right, so we've got 3 columns. That's excellent. We're looking at a couple of issues here. We obviously need to add some space in between our columns, and we could probably use some padding inside of this box element here. So let's come back to our text editor. And when I think about adding padding and margin to the box element, which lives inside of our column, I remember that we had that really cool property that we could add to all the elements on our page to make sure that we're taking the padding and margin and including it in the total dimensions of our property. So let me explain how that works again. Come up to your column classes. We're going to use the asterisk sign to select every element on the page that exists. And then do you remember the property called box sizing and border box? So usually you have an element of a certain dimension and then it adds on padding and then it adds on width. And you've got an element with specific dimensions, but by adding the this property here, we're saying just include the padding and the margin into the size of our element and make it the actual size. So for an example, if you had an image that was 100 by 100 pixels, and then you added 5 pixels of margin all around it and 5 pixels of padding all around it, all of a sudden you would have an element that is 120 pixels by 120 pixels. So that's all we're doing here. And remember, we do that to help control our columns so they don't get all cattywampus on us, okay? So let's come back down to our box class. And first, let's add some space between our columns. So we're going to add some margin. And let's go ahead and just, add 24 pixels of space between our entire box. Let's come back and check it out. And I like that. That looks good. Now, one thing that I want to point out with margin is we added 24 pixels around the entire box. Notice how over here near the edge of the screen, it's smaller, and between these 2 elements, it's larger. It's because we got 24 pixels here on this element and 24 pixels of margin on this element. So just one thing to note when you're adding margin to elements that are next to each other, those 2 margins are going to add up and make it double the space. All right, so now we want to add some padding. And to style this really cool, I want to add some padding on the top, left and right, but probably a little bit more padding on the bottom than the top. So let me show you how we can do this. Back in our text editor, go ahead and press enter and go ahead and write out padding. Now I'm going to take the first side that I want to add padding to, which is the top, and let's add something like 36 pixels. Okay, now I'm going to take the left side and add 24 pixels. The bottom, I want to add 40 pixels. And then the left side, let's add 24 pixels. Okay, and let me tell you what's happening here. So traditionally, just the single word padding, if we don't define a side that we're adding it to, it puts the padding all around the element, right? Well, by adding these numbers in here, we're grabbing 4 sides and doing it this way. You start from the top and you work clockwise. So the first number is always going to be the top, and then it's going to be the right, the bottom, and the left. So just one thing to note there. All right, I like that. So let's check this out again. That is looking way better. I think this is great. This looks great on desktop. So let's leave it as is. This is perfect. Now let's shrink this down to a mobile state and see what happens. Oh man. Check this out. All of our columns, let me refresh that, get rid of the blue lines. You can see we still have our box shadow and everything is just messed up inside of here. So we can do a similar thing that we did to the boxes up here. Remember how this was a column width of 50 and they were running into each other? But then once we hit a mobile state, we said, hey, make this column of 50 100% in a mobile state. So why don't we go ahead and do the same thing here? And let's find where we added, it's going to be in our mobile state. Let's find that column 6. Since we want to do the same thing with our column 4, we can actually just put a comma and then grab our column 4 class, right? Because the comma means and. So column 6 and column 4, we want to add this width of 100% and a margin of 0. So let's go back and check that out. All right, so that's looking pretty good. I'm digging it. Totally dig it. All right, we still have these square corners here, so let's go ahead and round that out real fast. Come back up to our box, and then just after the padding, let's add a border radius, and about 7 pixels should do it. And let's shave off some of the corners a little bit. All right, that is awesome. This is looking way better. I love it. I love it. I love it. All right, so on a mobile state, as I look on this, there's probably one more thing that I want to do. It's inheriting this padding that we set on the element. So why don't we go ahead and actually reduce the padding here? All right, so let's scroll down to our mobile class, and right under the column, let's grab that. Oops, I deleted my bracket here. There we go. Grab the box class. Okay, and all we want to do here is change the padding, and let's make it hug the edges pretty close. All right, and then I think that should be okay. And then I just want to make sure in a mobile that this has a display a block on it, just to be safe, to make sure the boxes are stacking on each other. All right, let's come back to it, refresh, get rid of my blue lines, and you can see that we've taken the content inside of our box and we've hugged it to the edges. And we're still inheriting our padding of 24 pixels, which I'm gonna go ahead and just leave. That looks pretty good. All right, so the last thing to do to this section, I'm gonna make this full screen, is to add our button down here at the bottom. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. All right, so we've got this column 4 here, and we've got our row. And since the button is right under these columns, why don't we go ahead and create a new row under this. That makes a lot of sense. So let's make a div class of row. And then we'll go ahead and put our column in here. And this column is going to take up the entire width of our row here. So let's do the holy Moses class of, what was it, column 12. Okay, and then inside of here, let's add a button. So we can actually just grab the button element and let's just leave it like that. And we're going to write learn more. All right, so let's see how that looks right now. I'm going to refresh this. Oh, look at it over here, this tiny little baby button. All right, so we want our button to be blue, big, and in the middle here. So we're probably going to have to grab a class. So let's come back to our text editor. I'm going to add a class onto our button. And since it's called Learn More, why don't we name the class Learn More? Be a little bit specific. All right, so up here in our custom styles, let's see, where do we want to place this in our hierarchy? We're working with columns here. We've got some elements. Let's add our button right here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the button class and let's add some default styles here, okay? And let's make the font size bigger. I think 32 pixels should do. Let's check that out. All right, that's a good size. We want it to be a little bit bolder, so we can play around with the font weight again. And man, let's make this 700. Make it really bold. And we remember in our example website that we want this font to be white. So we can change it like so. And then we wanted the background color of the button. I always do that. Background color of the button to be blue. And I'm going to look at the class that I'm using here, the hex code. I'm going to copy it, bring it over. And it's 0069FF. So go ahead and write that in. All right, let's see how our button is looking so far. Okay, very nice. We need to get it centered here and we need to add some padding around this, okay? So back to our text editor. I'm going to add a padding 15 pixels and 60 pixels. And I want to explain here what's happening. So on our box, we said that when we're working with padding and we use 4 numbers in here that we're working clockwise from top all the way down to the left side, going clockwise. Well, when we take the padding property again, and this time we put only 2 values in here, what it does is because it starts on top, it's going to say, hey, we need a top padding of 15 pixels. Then it's going to go over to the right side and say we need a padding of 16 pixels. And then it's going to go and say, wait a minute, there's not any more values in here. So since the first one starts with the top, let's make the top and the bottom a padding of 15 pixels and the left and the right a padding of 60 pixels. All right, so let's check that out. So I really do like that. We just need to get this button in the center and round off our corners. So back to our text editor. We can go ahead and add a display of block just so the button's a little bit easier to work with. We want the text inside of the button to make sure that it's always aligned in the center. And then I want to make sure that there's space around this button. So if it gets too close to other elements, I want to make sure that we create a space around it. And let's just create a small space around it, like of 5 pixels. And I want to add that border radius. Okay, and then, I don't know, I keep favoring the 7 pixels. It seems like it's a really good, just the right amount to shave off of these corners here. All right, that's better. So we want to position this. So if I was to put, well, we added the text align center to our button, but that's obviously just taking the font or the text inside of it, the learn more, and making that center. Now we need to make sure that our button is centered. So we've added this class we can work with specifically. So why don't we go ahead and grab it? So let's take our element and grab our class. All right, and to move this thing around a little bit easier, we always like to put these in a display of block, right? And then we can just add that margin of auto. And remember, the margin of auto is going to take all the space, which right now we have a ton of space on the right side of the button. And it's going to take all that space, divide it into, and distribute it evenly on each side of our element. So let's come into here, and that's great. I like that. That's looking really good, and let's see how this looks mobile. All right, scrolling through this. The button is fine with me. The only thing that's really screaming at me is this header right here. So why don't we go ahead and make this header smaller while we're in a mobile state? All right. So let's come back to our text editor, and remember we put a class on this header, section header 2. I'm going to copy this. All right, so let's come down to our mobile state, and we're going to put this right above the columns. All right, so that's better. So let's try a font size of like 55 pixels this time instead. All right, back to our preview. And that looks pretty good, and I'm going to be nitpicky here, and I'm going to make it 5 pixels smaller. Okay, I love it, I love it, I love it. Let's call this section, this lesson, this video, a wrap, and just give ourselves a pat on the back because we did such an awesome job with this, and let's move